Hello, my name is Samir Gandesha, and I'm Director of the Institute for the Humanities here at SFU in Vancouver, BC, Canada. It gives me tremendous pleasure to welcome you to this online, I suppose, launch and roundtable discussion of Toward the Critique of Violence, a critical edition edited by Peter Fenves and Julia Ng. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is being hosted on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, who have in the past and continue to this very day to resist ongoing colonial violence, not least in the form of the police, which manifests what Benjamin calls in this essay a spectral mixture of both law instating and law preserving violence. It is such violence that could be said to constitute the myth of the colonial state. And here I'd just like to briefly quote Benjamin, because I think it's particularly timely. The police constitute a form of violence directed toward legal ends under the law pertaining to orders, but with the simultaneous authorization to set these ends for itself within broad limits. The ignominy of such an authority, which is felt by few only because its authority rarely suffices even for the crudest interventions, but is therefore allowed to range all the more blindly in the most vulnerable areas and against those with any degree of reflection, those from whom the state finds no protection through its laws, lies in the fact that with the police, the separation of law positing and law preserving violence is annulled. I think this passage must find a particular sort of resonance among the Wet'suwet'en peoples and their allies who've been resisting and confronting the RCMP's enforcement in a very brutal manner of an injunction on behalf of Coastal GasLink on their traditional unceded territories, several hundred kilometers north of here in British Columbia. Benjamin's 1921 challenging and enigmatic text has proven extremely influential for a range of contemporary thinkers, among them Slavoj Žižek, Judith Butler, and of course, Giorgio Agamben. It now appears here in a new translation by Julia Ng, and as the description reads, the volume includes 21 notes and fragments by Benjamin, along with passages from all contemporary texts. These encounter for the first time in English provocative arguments about law and violence, advanced by Hermann Cohen, Kurt Hiller, Erich Unger, and Emil Lederer. A new translation of selections from Georges Sorel's Reflections on Violence further illuminates Benjamin's critical program. The volume also includes, for the first time in any language, a bibliography Benjamin drafted for the expansion of the essay and the development of a corresponding philosophy of law. An extensive introduction afterward provide additional context. Now, the fact that it includes excerpts from contemporaneous texts is especially valuable, I think, given the widely noted difficulty of the text. In an essay in the 2017 volume edited by Moran and Salzani, entitled Towards the Critique of Violence, Benjamin and Agamben, Alison Ross highlights precisely this point when she explains that many of the crucial terms within critique of violence prove substantially meaningless without the possibility of clarifying references to other pieces from the same period. So I think, again, this is really a tremendous contribution to the scholarship on this extremely important essay. Also, if you'd like to sign up for a mailing list precisely to keep up with events such as this, as well as other events, I'm going to put a link in the chat. So I'd also just like to thank Huyen Pham, who's a communications person in the Department of Humanities, but for many years was our program assistant and did tremendous work for the Institute, for which I'm most grateful. And also Wallace Hartley, who's program assistant in the Department of Humanities now. And they're the ones who really make events like these happen. So without any further ado, I'd just like to introduce our chair. Alberto Toscano is Professor of Critical Theory and co-director of the Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought at Goldsmiths, University of London. and visiting faculty here at the Digital Democracies Institute in the School of Communication at SFU. He is the author of Cartographies of the Absolute with Jeff Kinkle and Fanaticism on the Uses of an Idea. He's also co-editor of the Sage Handbook of Marxism. He's member of the editorial board of Historical Materialism and series editor of the Italian list for Seagull Books. I'm very pleased to say that Alberto is also an associate of the Institute for the Humanities. I'd like to personally say just how lucky we are to have Alberto here at SFU. He's spoken at the Institute a couple of times in the past, and I think the most recent being February of 2017, when he gave a talk on the invention of the savage. Alberto, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Samir, for the very kind introduction, but especially for the framing comments linking the readability of this text to very live struggles against colonization here in British Columbia. So I'll just say a couple of words about the structure of our discussion today, for those of you in the audience. So we will speak a few minutes each. I count myself in because I have a minor supporting role in this fabulous compendium that Peter and Julia have put together. So we will start with Peter Fenves, one of the two editors with Julia of this volume. And I will now introduce all of the speakers so that we don't interrupt our conversation as we go along. And everybody will speak for about 5 to 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for questions. I think when we were speaking about the event beforehand, also with Julia, I think one of the things that obviously is of interest to address, not least because a number of the people here are translators of the excerpts. Well, everybody's a translator here of text in this book. To discuss also the questions of not just the translation, but the translatability of the conceptual apparatus and conceptual networks that work in Benjamin's text. So just brief introductions in order of the presentations. So Peter Fenves is the Joan Serapta Professor of Literature at Northwestern University. He's a professor of German Comparative Literary Studies and Jewish Studies, and the author of several books, including The Messianic Reduction, Walter Benjamin and the Shape of Time, and Late Kant, Toward Another Law of the Earth. Peter will be followed by Donna Hollander, who is the Associate Professor of the Department of Religious Studies at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, where she's also an associate member of the Department of Philosophy and a member of the MA program in Cultural Studies and Critical Theory. Her research areas are 20th century French and German philosophy, modern Jewish thought, and German Jewish studies. She is the author of Ethics Out of Law, Hermann Cohen on the Neighbor, Exemplarity and Chosenness, Rosenzweig and Derrida on the Nation of Philosophy, and is also the translator of Jakob Taubes's The Political Theology of Paul. Donna will be followed by Lisa Marie Anderson, who is the professor and chair of German at Hunter College City University of New York, and the author of German Expressionism and the Messianism of a Generation. She's also the translator and editor of 2 books on Johann Georg Hamann with Northwestern University Press. Her articles have appeared in the Wilson Quarterly, the Goethe Yearbook, German Life and Letters, and a number of other venues. Her translations have appeared with Lexington Books and the Journal of Nietzsche Studies. I will not introduce myself since Samir has already taken care of that. After my brief presentation, we'll hear from Bruce Rosenstock, who's professor of religion at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His most recent monograph is Transfinite Life, Oscar Goldberg and the Vitalist Imagination. He's currently working on a book exploring the themes of kinship and incest in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, and the influence of these themes on the emergence of the African slave trade and anti-Black racism in the modern era. Next, we'll hear from Austin Harrington, who's the Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Leeds. His recent publications include German Cosmopolitan Social Thought and the Idea of the West, Voices from Weimar, and Jörg Simmel, Essays on Art and Aesthetics. And our list of speakers will conclude with Julia Eng, who's Senior Lecturer in Critical Theory and Co-Director of Goldsmith Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought. Though on this occasion, she will be speaking in a personal capacity in solidarity with the ongoing campaign to #boycott Goldsmiths and reject its management's efforts to push through redundancies and structuring across academic and professional staff. And for those of you interested also in following that campaign, you can look at the Goldsmiths UCU, that is to say the University and College Union website and or Twitter feed to keep abreast of developments. So without further ado, I'll pass the floor or mic over to Peter.
Alberto, thank you. And I want to thank you and Professor Gandesha for producing this this webinar, this colloquium. It's actually a great honor to do so, and it's a chance to reflect on this volume. And for me, honestly, to meet some of the people who are involved in it. We did the last stages of this this volume during the pandemic, which also is a centenary because Benjamin was writing during the previous pandemic, the influential one of just after the First World War. And actually some of the figures that are involved in Benjamin's essay to some extent succumbed to the influential pandemic. It's sort of a side element of what Benjamin was reflecting on in that period. One of whom was Max Weber, just as an example, the one who founded the journal in which it was the text was published. So there's a lot to talk about with respect to this volume. In fact, this is one of the reasons to produce something like this, is because it's very rich. The first thing that comes to mind as I reflect on this, which I haven't had a chance to do in this joint this kind of joint venture, is that it originated for me 20 years ago in a diner in Evanston with Giorgio Agamben and Werner Hammacher, who wanted to produce something like this, to produce a volume. And Werner was very insistent on the shape it would take and certain phrases that didn't work in English. So I noted those down and worked it through, and it became very complicated. The resulting volume is very different from this conversation with Giorgio and Donna. But instead of reflecting on this long process of its production, I'm going to just take up, actually spontaneously, Alberto's response having to do with translation. That is, what are we doing when we're translating it? There's a peculiar aspect to Kritik der Gewalt and the associated writings that he was producing here, which is that, as is well known, or those who are part of this, who are enmeshed in this scholarship, but he was at the same time writing the task of the translator and translating Baudelaire. So at one point he was waiting for a book from France to arrive, which was Sorel's Reflections on Violence. And on the other hand, he was translating a French book, which he had at hand, Baudelaire's Tableau Parisien. And at the same time, the essay seems to have, the Critique of Violence seems to have no element, no explicit element on the translation of the key term violence, that is Gewalt, which doesn't just mean, it doesn't just mean violence. There'd be maybe gewalttätig or something like that would be violent, and so there's something happening in Benjamin's text with respect to the task of the translator that he's also reflecting on with an example of a Franco-German example, which is Brot und Pain, of the example of bread. So this seems to be, or one could argue that the translating of this essay is an internal element of its composition. That is, Benjamin is also translating. He's literally, as we've emphasized in the notes, literally translating Sorel, large parts of it. It doesn't exist in German, and Benjamin seems to have some role in the production of its translation at a point in which he seems to be repudiating everything Sorel stands for good reason. And so the one thing to ask, just to start the conversation is, or the one thing to think about is, the beginning and the end of the essay are internal translations of within German of the word Gewalt. It begins by isolating what he calls a prägnant, which translated as impressive, sense of the word, a pithy sense of the word Gewalt, in contrast to its unpithy or unimpressive sense. And it concludes by a discrimination between various forms of Gewalt that ends with the tautological form of waltende, die waltende Gewalt, which we've translated as pending violence, in contrast to some of the previous ones. Very problematic translation, but it's a problematic term. What I'm going to just sort of begin our conversation by emphasizing this. That's how the essay begins, by isolating a sense of the word Gewalt, which the result of which is that no German speaker, like leave aside other translations, no German speaker can read this without translating German, the German that those German speakers think they know. Because always there's the question, am I using Gewalt in its impressive sense? And there's a further consequences. What happens when I fail to understand it, to use it in its impressive sense, which is its moral sense, its sittliche. It involves Sittlichkeit, morality in a broad sense. So Germans, in reading this essay, leave aside everyone else, all of us, so to speak, all of those who are not thinking, working in German, Germans can only read this essay by translating it. And the end of the essay, they have a redistribution of the word Gewalt such that only one sense of it is not to be rejected, is not verwerflich, is not reprehensible, which is probably the colloquial sense of the term. So all uses of the word Gewalt are reprehensible except one, which is tautological, die waltende Gewalt, which is not reprehensible. It's as though, but what Benjamin is doing is not a translation of French into German. He's translating German into German and allowing only the tiniest window for the use of Gewalt. Now that's amazing and attractive and repulsive and problematic in every sense of the term. And I'm going to conclude this by saying that Benjamin seems to be reflecting on what he was doing in the critique of violence in this form, in one way, in a passage of One Way Street, where he talks about this. He says, here's a formula for producing fat books. And there are a lot of them in German. I guarantee you, lots and lots of fat books in the 1920s, big, fat, gigantic tomes that say nothing. And here's how you do it, Benjamin says. You spend lots of time in the introduction producing enormous vocabulary that you never use in the rest of the book. And he did the exact inverse in this essay. He introduces at the very end, as the climax, a set of new terms, which are never used earlier in the essay. It's a kind of operation to detomize, to get rid of the kind of massive verbiage in which, I'm going to just simply Gewalt, violence is encased so that it's not seen for what it is. And with that, I'm going to pass on to Donna.
Thank you so much, Peter, for starting us off with that. And you've been just the most excellent companion, both for rereading Benjamin's essay and a companion and interlocutor for translation, as you've just exhibited here. It's just absolutely so stimulating and delightful. And a mundane consequence, I would say, of what you're saying about the German to German translation aspect is that this volume is not relevant only for those who need to or want to read Benjamin in English. It really needs to be read as a research resource, worldwide. And I've only just begun to make my acquaintance with this wonderful volume. It's really a fantastic accomplishment, Julia and Peter and all the contributing translator commentators to have produced this critical edition, source book commentary on Benjamin's essay. And Stanford University Press, I think, is also to be greatly commended for sponsoring the production of such a volume. It's more of a German tradition to create critical editions, of course, as well as students' editions, study editions, source books designed to support the study of canonical texts. And we don't see this so much in English language publishing. So, and I think that sort of work is just so rewarding, so useful, and will, I'm sure, generate a great deal of new study and thought. I'm struck by the fact that the rich explanations and investigations you've provided and commissioned actually lead in many directions for the study of 20th century German and European thought. And before I get to my own on-topic comments, I want to say that one connection between what I'm finding in these pages and my own current interests is the mention of early 20th century legal ethnography, comparative legal studies, which Benjamin apparently encountered, the school of Josef Kohler, and Benjamin's encounter with the study of Mesoamerican legal traditions through Walter Lehmann in Munich. And there's also the appearance of a work in this working bibliography, which apparently you've published for the first time, by Mordche Rappaport. And indeed, I've also had reasons to currently to look at how Jewish law came into the purview of the legal comparatists of that period. So I especially appreciate that part of your investigation and the afterword, Julia, to which I'm sure I'll be coming back. So I think my role here is supposed to be to supply some background by way of contrast from Hermann Cohen's theory of ethics and law in order to supplement the source book. And I'll mention two aspects of that. The first is that we see Benjamin drawing on the language of jurisprudence, the study of law of his time, in his explorations of law and violence or force or power, Gewalt, means and ends, application, and much more. Benjamin uses the distinction between natural law theory and positivist theories of law, legal positivism, to make some observations about means and ends. Julia Eng accordingly situates Benjamin in debates of his time regarding law, and Peter Fenves points to one of the main themes of the Critique of Violence essay as Benjamin's finding that there is no mediation between law and justice. Hermann Cohen's philosophy is relevant in this connection because his ethics of pure will, which Benjamin also cites directly at one point, is a philosophy of ethics and law. Undergirding it is the thesis that ethics is rooted in or generated out of law, which is an intriguing idea because it goes against our common intuition that it should be the other way around. We ordinarily imagine laws or systems of law to emerge out of or be somehow undergirded by or accountable to moral principles or intuitions. This sort of a principle can be seen as the basis of any attempt to argue that a law is unjust, to seek greater justice by challenging existing legislation, and the idea that laws are founded in morality or accountable to morality is typically aligned with a natural law theory. A positivist theory of law, by contrast, would view the question of whether law emerges from something like morality as beside the point, since such a theory defines law as posited law. Simply. In Cohen's idea that ethics is somehow founded on or generated by law, there's therefore a clear connection to legal positivism. One of Cohen's targets is the idea that, as he puts it in his ethics, the idea that ethics has something to do with a transcendent shepherd's world. In contrast to such an image, for Cohen, ethics has a being, a reality. He argues for an idea of the good that has shed all noumenal trappings. He finds that while Kantian critique made adequate provisions that the thing in itself would be merely a methodological formula, that he views ethical theory as endangered by the continuing suspicion that the idea of the good is only an idea, such that Sollen, normativity, would denote, quote, if not a catechism of commandments, then at least a fantasy region of pious hopes, unquote. Cohen's theory, according to which ethics is oriented to law as a scientific factum, is supposed to avoid the danger posed by what he calls the exclusive autocracy of religion. In my book that was mentioned, I begin my exploration of Cohen's project from the vantage point of classic legal positivism as represented by Hans Kelsen. Julia's afterward discusses positive law, natural law debates, and there's an immediate echo of Cohen's point that understanding law as a scientific factum avoids the danger of the exclusive autocracy of religion. There's an immediate echo of that in Kelsen's criticism of that Julia cites of Erich Kaufmann's embrace of natural law as a juridical metaphysics, which could only be, says Kelsen, rooted in a revealed religion. But as I explore in the first chapter of my book, there's an important point of contrast between classic legal positivism as represented by Kelsen and what Cohen is doing. For Kelsen, to dissociate law from the realm of nature and causality also entails dissociating it from morality. By contrast, for Cohen, to deny that law belongs to the realm of nature and to pursue his method of accounting for law is also a path of affirming the ethical nature of law. In the arena of philosophical ethics, Cohen takes legal science or jurisprudence, Rechtswissenschaft, as the factum of science for ethics. Law thus occupies a role analogous to that of mathematical physics in theoretical philosophy. We can understand this approach from the point of view of Kelsen's method as he describes it in Reine Rechtslehre, where he sets law off against the realm of nature if you begin from seeing them as empirical phenomena taking place in time and space and governed by the laws of causality. For Kelsen, the meaning of a legal phenomenon is intelligible only thanks to a norm that supplies the necessary interpretative scheme for assigning that meaning. But this norm is not a moral norm. It's a hypothetical link between a given action and a given juridical consequence, and this link has no intrinsic presupposed link with morality. Cohen's project in Ethics of Pure Will similarly regards material offered by norms and institutions, juridical facta, as material for analysis, but he doesn't oppose legality to morality. Instead, his project is to acknowledge morality as an immanent force within legality. And Cohen's ethics also comprises a challenge to Kant's ethics for having in some ways failed to see the share of legality and morality. For Kelsen, to dissociate law from the realm of nature and causality also, I'll say that in the ethics, Cohen undertakes numerous analyses of juridical facta for the purpose of elucidating certain ethical principles and their corresponding realization. These analyses are informed by a view of the history of political juridical institutions that proceed along a trajectory of moral political progress. And in the selection contained in this volume, that progress is also mapped onto the path of the human individual who is guilty of some transgression. The path of the self, the subject to self-responsibility, is an overcoming of fate, Schicksal. One way that Cohen describes this progress as no longer employing what we would call, religious, maybe technologies such as sacrifice in order to purify oneself of the transgression, which in that religious view would be classified as inadvertent, an accident. Moral judgment is the path of self-responsibility. So that brings me to the second matter I wanted to comment on. Benjamin retrieves a passing comment, as Benjamin puts it, by Cohen about ancient or mythical conceptions of fate. This is the one quotation of Cohen in Benjamin's essay. This is actually a passage in the Ethics in which Cohen makes clear that he sees a difference between religion and myth. Religion represents moral progress over myth. from the point of view of Cohen's oeuvre, here we can note his standing as a leading philosopher of Jewish religion alongside his systematic philosophical works, of which the Ethics is one. And from that point of view, we can note Cohen's major work, which appeared only posthumously in 1919, Religion of Reason Out of the Sources of Judaism, a project that presented itself as supplementary, as an addition to the systematic philosophical work that Cohen had done, and in particular, as adding on to the Ethics. Cohen begins the religion by explaining why the Ethics needs to be supplemented by a philosophical account of religion, because it turns out that philosophical ethics doesn't account for all aspects of being human. In the religion, Cohen draws on what he calls the sources of Judaism to account for such phenomena as sin, suffering, compassion, and atonement. And he charts the emergence of the religion of reason as a separation from myth, from any elements in biblical religion that Cohen regarded as mythical. So it's interesting to see in this passage of the Ethics that he already has a clear idea that myth is a primeval form of religion, and that religion is already an improvement over myth. And the phenomenon in which both Cohen and Benjamin, in the passage in which he quotes Cohen, are interested seems to be that inadvertence, non-knowledge of what the deed or misdeed is fundamental to transgression. The unwitting overstepping of the boundary or of a line is more primary, more originary than any norm. And I gather that that is a clear point where for Benjamin, fate opens a view onto the injustice at the heart of violence, where modern conceptions of legal equality and enlightened conceptions of penal law, criminal law, punishment can't overcome mythical notions such as that of fate. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here.
Thank you very much. Donna, I think we'll pass the word over to Lisa Marie.
Great.
I can hear you just fine.
Great. My connection cut out for a minute there. That was terrible timing. Thank you, Alberto, for putting this together today. And thank you to Peter and Julia for inviting me and Kurt Hiller to play a role in this wonderful volume. I'm going to say a few words to introduce him, since he is not everywhere a widely known figure, a really fascinating figure who worked in lots of different areas. He was one of the founders, Kurt Hiller was, of an early expressionist group in Berlin. It served as a cabaret and a forum for experimental poetry, and this is the context in which he and Benjamin first became aware of each other. He was also a collaborator of Magnus Hirschfeld's in the struggle for gay rights. He was an early advocate for the decriminalization of abortion. And these political commitments turned him into the driving force behind the left-wing movement known as activismus, or activism with a capital A, which in the immediate wake of the war argued that art needed to be a political tool, and that artists and intellectuals needed to be more directly engaged in political affairs and needed to work closely together with the proletariat in the struggle against capitalism. Benjamin was, of course, quite skeptical of this movement, and he distanced himself from it and from Hiller shortly after he had published an essay in Hiller's journal in 1916. So the essay that Benjamin quotes from, Anti-Cain, is unlike Critique of Violence, and Peter, this is something you point out in the introduction, unlike Critique of Violence, Hiller's essay is very deliberately of a particular historical moment. And that's one of the things that makes it challenging to translate. It was finished in April 1919, as the German Revolution was still sorting itself out and was still doing so in quite a bloody way. Hiller was a revolutionary, but he aligned himself neither with the Social Democrats of Weimar nor primarily with the movement toward the Soviet councils as it was emerging in Germany. He was committed instead to his own notion of logokratie, a hegemony of intellectuals informed by that activist spirit that that I was describing just a moment ago. So this ideal, a hegemony of intellectuals, animated all of Hiller's political thought, but especially his pacifism, which would evolve over the course of a very long career, but was quite radical at this particular moment in the spring of 1919. And I think this is the primary thing that the anti-Cohen essay does, is articulate what absolute pacifism looks like, certainly in Germany in the wake of World War I. So the essay is really about the rejection of Gewalt, which Hiller characterizes throughout the piece as Cohen's instrument or Cohen's method, and which Hiller rejects because it's not working, and it's not working for three groups in particular. He says that it's not working for revolutionaries. He was a staunch anti-capitalist, but he refused to justify at this point revolutionary violence of the kind he saw being used by the Bolshevists or the Spartakists in Berlin. And anti-Cohen, the essay puts it quite radically. Hiller writes, eternal injustice for all is preferable to the killing of a single individual. So while he was all for nonviolent class struggle, the essay condemns class warfare. The second group for whom Gewalt is not working are those who are facing the terrorism of the counter-revolution in Germany. Certainly, Hiller's essay condemns the brutal punishment. Here, as elsewhere, he is a really caustic and powerful critic in language that one struggles to render, of the conservative forces, and here he would mean conservative forces from across the political spectrum, who are trying to put down the last throes of the German Revolution. But he warns just as strongly against responding to that terror in kind with more Gewalt. And then the third group for whom anti-Cohen says Gewalt is just not working and we need to try something else are Germans. And so he's advocating very strongly in the spring of 1919 for Germany to take the lead and become the first nation to disarm, to abolish its army, and to practice on a national level non-resistance and what he calls faith in the force of law. He calls conscription the cruelest form of slavery, even when it's practiced by a socialist or a communist government. So again, his pacifism is trumping his anti-capitalism at this moment. And in a way that speaks to us today, I think he advocates not only for the destruction of weapons stocks, but also for an end to what he calls the entire border control racket. This radical pacifism is based largely in the essay on the biblical commandment, thou shalt not kill, which Hiller supplements with the words, even for the sake of an idea. Any idea, no matter how noble, was subordinate for him in 1919 to life itself. And this is how he puts it in the passage that Benjamin quotes. Higher still than the happiness and justice of an existence stands existence itself. We demand that no one be permitted to take the life of one brother in order to bring freedom to another. Benjamin, of course, believed that Hiller had misconstrued the biblical commandment and had done so based on an anachronistically modern conception of the sanctity of life. And most of all, I think he couldn't agree with Hiller that justice should be subordinated to life itself. So even if Benjamin's essay communicates this only obliquely, I think it's quite clear that Hiller was one of the pacifists, one of the radical pacifists of the time who prompted him to this critique of violence. So I think I'll leave it there and pass it over to Alberto. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lisa Marie. So I suppose in some sense the Sorel question is perhaps maybe not necessarily so, but perhaps among the more vexed dimensions regarding the translatability or readability, certainly into are present of some of Benjamin's arguments. And so I just wanted to make just a few remarks about that. Maybe to begin with, to reflect on the very complicated history, indeed even geography, as Robert Paris puts it in a great text on the geography of Sorelism, you know, the history and geography of that political translatability of Sorel's work. Obviously not just Reflections, which was not by any means straightforwardly the most significant or impactful of Sorel's writings, which of course both preceded and followed that text, which in itself represents actually a fairly circumscribed moment in Sorel's production, the one that, again, it can be identified as revolutionary syndicalism in its most strict sense. So, of course, it's difficult, nigh on impossible, to think of Sorel without the dark aura of an affinity or even a generative role within the genealogy of European fascism, not least because of the rather dubious appropriation of his legacy or writings by Mussolini, most famously perhaps in his 1932 text on the Dottrina del Fascismo. But Sorel, who had possibly more influence on the political scene in Italy than anywhere else, let's say, that already in the 1900s, was also a figure of considerable significance long before Benjamin got to discussing him in 1921. He was read and influential in Japan, in Peru, especially in the writing of Mariátegui. He was a very significant influence in the political education of the young Lukács, via Ervin Szabo. Lukács talks about this in retrospect already in the 1960s, for instance. And so we have this question of the translatability of different aspects and moments in Sorel, who, of course, in a very peculiar career, which of course started like in his mid-40s, a very idiosyncratic figure of both a political, intellectual, and theorist, then moved through a number of positions through his association with Croce in the debate about the crisis of Marxism, through revolutionary syndicalism, through a relatively brief alliance with a nationalist syndicalism and a far-right monarchism, even in the Action Française, and then to a late embrace, right, of ambiguous, that too, of the Russian Revolution shortly before his death. So I think all of that is part of the picture. What's very interesting, in a way, in Benjamin's uptake of and use of Sorel, who is the most quoted figure, I suppose, most quoted text in this in Toward the Critique of Violence, is a very significant operation vis-a-vis our reception or our kind of common sense regarding the reflections on violence of Sorel, namely that even though myth, as of course Donna has noted vis-a-vis Hermann Cohen, is a very crucial term in the construction of the conceptual network, let's say, of Toward the Critique of Violence, Sorelian myth, or the idea that the general strike is itself a myth, is not an object of critique. In fact, is not really an object of discussion in Benjamin. And so the condition for inserting a very specific moment, really, in Sorel's text, which is crucially the distinction between a political and a proletarian general strike as a way of articulating the specificity of the conception of violence that Benjamin is moving towards. The condition for doing that is, in a sense, to present a Sorel without myth, and to present the general strike as something other than a myth, in as much as myth is conceived by Benjamin in the wake of Cohen as having to do with fate, necessity, and so on. Of course, the myth of a general strike is a is a very curious myth viewed from that standpoint. First of all, because of course the point of the myth is to break with necessity, repetition, and reproduction of the status quo, and also because Sorel's own conceptualization of myth bears very little relationship, in fact, to the distinction between myth and religion, and is really a kind of semi-Bergsonian way of thinking of myth in terms of a kind of intuitive, indivisible, instantaneous form of knowledge that is composed of blocks of images. Parenthetically, it's a notion of blocks of images that then played a role in Gramsci's own conception of the historical block and the use of this very idea, but that's kind of by the by. Beneath this then, so on one side we have a kind of subtraction or bracketing, right, of Sorelian myth in order to introduce the proletarian general strike into Benjamin's argument. Then we do also have other reasons, some of which are explicitly stated by Benjamin and some of which I guess are more implicit, for an affinity, if not necessarily a sympathy and certainly not a convergence, namely Sorel's critique of natural law. Indeed, his kind of anti-Jacobin polemics can be seen to play a role in this text, whose conception of revolutionary violence, if it has one, is certainly not one aligned with the terror. But also Sorel's antipathy to the nexus of state power, the protagonism of intellectuals, a very negative figure for Sorel, though of course Sorelians ended up all being intellectuals, Mussolini not least of them, and the revolutionary general strike. And then if we just, before I conclude, I think it's also striking that of course Benjamin, as a translator of Sorel in the quotes, has to confront Sorel's own lexical and conceptual distinctions vis-a-vis violence, but does not import them into his own text, right? So Sorel makes this distinction between la force et la violence, with la force being on the side of the state, but also, interesting enough, on the side of a term that is negative for both Benjamin and Sorel, namely utopia, where violence is on the side of the proletarian strike. In translating Sorel, interestingly, la force becomes Macht or Staatsgewalt, whilst violence becomes Kraft, not Gewalt. So it's a kind of, there's a curious way in which Benjamin translates Sorel, again, in his own text, but then does not use Sorel's conceptual distinctions for the sake of his own. And I guess lastly, and maybe this resonates to some extent with the wonderful excavation of Benjamin's later engagements with juridical and legal and ethnographic debates in Julia's afterward. There's something, of course, very striking, became very striking to me because I basically only read beyond Reflections of Violence, only having been interpolated by Julia and Peter into this very delightful task, is that, of course, Sorel is an obsessive thinker of the juridical, and in fact is an obsessive thinker of the normativity of the ethics of producers. And in fact, his entire critique, indeed, of both Bakuninism and various strands of mainstream Marxism is that they fail to think that a normativity that is inherent in the very experience and life of producers. And so in many ways, the entire conception of law in Sorel himself and in the juridical is radically at odds, not just with the reception of Sorel here in Benjamin's text, but actually with the reception of Sorel in general as a kind of apologist of violence against the juridical order. And I think that's also a very striking dimension of his text. So I will stop here and then pass the mic over to Bruce.
Thank you, Alberto. Thank you to our hosts at the Institute for the Humanities
And thank you, of course, to Peter and to Julia. So Walter Benjamin, in a letter that he wrote to his friend Gershom Scholem at around the same time as he was working on this essay, said that he was interested in the figure of Erich Unger because both of them shared a similar interest in what he called the psychophysical problem as the basis of a new kind of politics. So what Benjamin meant was that Erich Unger and he believed that the key to a truly revolutionary political program lay in a transformation of class consciousness that would take place not on the plane of ideas, but on the plane of where the life processes of the body interface with the deepest layer of our psychic activity. Now, Unger pointed to the phenomena of yogic breath control. Unger wrote his dissertation on the psychophysical problem and spoke about a variety of different phenomena falling within the range of what would be unusual to the psychophysical phenomena that our daily life experiences. So he referred specifically to yogic breath control and the actual ability, in other words, that consciously we can alter our metabolic activity. But the power of the psychic, of consciousness, to alter one's physiological state is not witnessed solely or most significantly in the individual, according to Unger, but much more so in a collectivity, where there is a sort of resonance effect that begins with a single individual who has somehow is gifted with and enhanced with exceptional psychic power to alter her own physical state, and that then moves across the entire collectivity, lifting it into an enhanced capacity for action. Now, this might seem to most of us, and indeed it should seem to most of us, quite fascistic. And one is put in mind of Nazi mass theatricality and its quasi-hypnotic intoxication that was brought on by the very tonality of Der Führer's voice. Now, of course, and this, of course, comes much later, but neither Unger nor Benjamin would have ever endorsed what Unger's friend Oscar Goldberg, a little bit later in the 30s, once already the voice of Hitler had become the voice of the nation, what Oscar Goldberg called pseudo-bacchantic frenzy that had engulfed the German state. But how could Unger and Benjamin, of course, Goldberg aware of already what the danger is, but how could Unger and Benjamin separate themselves from the pseudo-bacchantic frenzy of a fascist collective, from their own idea of a revolutionary transformation of the collective, what Benjamin called in an essay that is in a part of the One-Way Street, that is the most clearly influenced by Erich Unger, I believe, the To the Planetarium, which concludes the One-Way Street, I believe. How could they distinguish the kind of thing that was happening within fascistic collectivities from what Benjamin himself spoke of as a trance
or a paroxysm of a, quote, genuine cosmic experience? So that's the question that I think confronts us when we see Benjamin and Unger together. Benjamin and Unger had some common answers to this fundamental question, the question of how to distinguish the positive trance and paroxysm that Benjamin speaks of from a purely fascistic one. And perhaps the most significant answer that I believe can be given by Benjamin and by Unger is that the collective must never be united by the friend-enemy binarism, that the collective cannot be created out of a definition of the other as enemy. Now, Unger does approach this in his discussion in Politics and Metaphysics, the text that I translated together with another for this, this collection. So what does this binarism, friend-enemy, and of course I'm referring to Carl Schmitt, what does this binarism not have? It does not have what both Unger and Benjamin would understand to be an organic unity. As little as an animal could be said to be alive, only to the extent that, for example, it sought to annihilate everything other than itself within its ecosystem. So Unger and Benjamin were interested in a form of collective expression that is indeed organic, but is not defined in the same terms of friend-enemy as we will read in Schmitt, but rather they're interested in precisely a different conception of the organic, one that is evolving in the biological theories of people like Hans Driesch and Jakob von Uexküll. Both of them deeply, they were aware of these two authors. Both of these German biologists were Darwinians who completely rejected the Kampf ums Leben, the struggle for life interpretation of natural selection, in favor of a holistic and ecological understanding of evolution. So the revolutionary collective that Unger and Benjamin wanted to create and hoped to construct would be moved by nothing less than a psychophysical impulse toward the evolution of a humanity no longer parceled into pseudo-organisms called nation states. Both Benjamin and Unger thought that the Great War was the extinction event of the old form of humanity, and that now finally released from the mechanistic and artificial construction of nation-state collectivities, the older form of a relationship to the cosmos itself that was evinced in mythic societies would be allowed to reassert itself, but this time taking full advantage of the scientific and technological advances that had been used as the basis during the Great War for weapons of mass death, and that would now be used in the next stage of human evolution. As Marx himself had described it in his economic and philosophical manuscripts, to humanize nature and naturalize humanity. And with that passage in mind, I believe, Benjamin in To the Planetarium wrote, quote, in technology, a physis, a nature, is being organized through which mankind's contact with the cosmos takes a new and different form from that which it had in nations and families. So the technophysis of this final stage of human evolution would reflect the release of the psychophysical dimension from its divisive pseudo-organic unities, namely nations and families, especially the nation state. So Benjamin found in Unger a kindred spirit. Both men believed that the collective revolution that alone can counter the pseudo-bacchantic fascist state that was emerging in their time must begin with those individuals who can tap into the cosmic power that drives the evolution of life and of humanity itself. So I could mention here Benjamin's love for the science fiction novel Les Bendio and his intention to use it in a planned volume on political theology, but time doesn't permit. One final point. Both Unger and Benjamin found inspiration in the Kabbalah and its doctrine of cosmic cataclysm and reparation. Unger learned his Kabbalah from Oscar Goldberg, but Benjamin, though deeply familiar himself with German Romantic receptions of the Kabbalah, had Gershom Scholem as his guide. As little as they believed in the pseudo-bacchantic fascist collective, Benjamin and Unger never imagined that the revolutionary collective could be achieved through a Promethean undertaking like that of the Soviet Union. The Kabbalah taught them that the restoration of the human cosmic bond had to happen in an instantaneous breakthrough of the trapped life force within our psychophysical bodies. This Kabbalistic teaching resonated with the way that Driesch and von Uxküll spoke about evolution as not just random mutations, but rather the instantaneous emergence of a whole new pattern for organic life, as if a kaleidoscope had shifted and a new form of life were suddenly visible. So if we look at Benjamin in conjunction with Unger, what we see is Benjamin's continuity with Goethe's or with Schilling's Naturphilosophie, combined with a radical anarchism that seeks to set humanity free from every division that the politics of friend-enemy has imposed upon it. Thank you, and I now turn it over to Austin.
Well, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Julia and Alberto. I would like to speak quite briefly, in fact, and hand over quite rapidly to Julia in her afterword. I'm here to speak about the essay by Emil Lederer in its relation to Benjamin's text. I only have a very few words to say. In all honesty, Lederer is in the collection because he is the figure who instigates the publication of Benjamin's essay. Lederer's own text was not something that Benjamin could have read, but it's a significant piece of writing for Lederer as the figure who enables the publication of Benjamin's text, and also because it represents perhaps a statement of the, so to speak, the outside-inside mainstream in which of the Weimar Republic to which Benjamin is speaking. And I'll just carry on by recalling Peter Gay's Weimar Germany book with its subtitle, The Outsider as Insider. When we think about what was an establishment, what was an order of power, what was the political establishment in Weimar Germany, it was intrinsically composed of those who were at the same time outsiders. And for the first time, Jewish figures become inducted into some position of public presence. And I say that as a foreword to how we think about Lederer as someone who is, on the one hand, in alignment with the Social Democrats and has connections, political connections to social democratic figures, and is quite in comparative terms, a powerful figure who supports, for example, the career of Karl Mannheim at Heidelberg in the 1920s. And he takes over the editorship of the Archiv für Sozialwissenschaft after the death of Max Weber in 1920. And he's someone who does not accept Benjamin's essay for Die Weissenblätter, but publishes it in the archive. He's someone who recognizes the challenges of Benjamin's stance, which falls outside of the academic conventions and disciplinary spaces that could possibly have received it, and he finds nonetheless a place for it. His own position is nonetheless a different one in some ways. I can hear resonances with what we've just heard from Bruce Rosenstock about Unger, in the sense that Lederer defends a conception of evolution. It's defined perhaps in a slightly more conventionally sociological fashion. He begins the essay by saying that violence is a thing of the past, a thing of obsolescence. By that he means that violence has been now experienced as a force that it explodes back upon its perpetrators, in contrast to a feudal age. The present is one in which any act of war rebounds against the perpetrator in a total situation of mass destruction, in which both armies and civilians are likewise destroyed. And he sees, in sociological terms, an evolution towards the institutionalization of violence and conflict in parliamentary relationships between classes and their corresponding parties. So he's someone trying to theorize or conceptualize the transmutation of violence into inevitable, inescapable relations of transaction in political forms on parliamentary stages. And about 5 years later, well, 7 or 8 years later, by the end of the 1920s, Karl Mannheim then outlines this broad conception, which I think is quite similar in its thrust to Lederer's thinking in his major book, Ideology and Utopia. And I will just finish by just reflecting on what that constellation represents for us today, the constellation between someone such as Benjamin, as well as Carl Schmitt, who is also published by Lederer in the Archive für Sozialwissenschaft, as figures, as dissident outsider figures who would not gain a hearing if it were not for figures who are outsiders on the inside, such as Lederer, who see that their own conventional sociological frameworks become aphoretic and beg their own questions, but they cannot act. So on the one hand, Lederer represents, one could say, some kind of problematic, ambivalent, aphoretic spokesperson for a social democratic mainstream center position, who is conscious and cognizant of that position's own contradictions, but does not wish to exclude Benjamin, sees Benjamin as this marginal outsider voice who must in some way be given a voice, be given representation. And it just reminds me of the kinds of contradictions and aporias that we face today in thinking about positions on the left between parliamentary incorporation and those on the left whose concern is to challenge the fundamental presuppositions of institutional representation on the left as part of the progressive project of collective emancipation. So those are just really my quite rambling, quite spontaneous thoughts for this event. And I'd like to hand on now, if I may, straight away to Julia. And thank you again.
Thanks very much. First of all, my deep thanks go to Alberto for making all this possible, putting this thing together, especially after what's been going on in the past 6 months. And also, of course, to Professor Gandesha and the Institute for Humanities at the Simon Fraser for hosting this. It's the first event that's actually been organized around our volume since it appeared last year at the height of the pandemic. And so I'm very grateful that everyone who contributed to the translations of the volume is finally able to convene, however virtually, to present their crucial contributions to the volume. Since today's discussion is focused on translation, I thought I would focus my remarks on some aspects of the volume that I think are particularly salient to getting a grasp on what sort of intervention translating Benjamin today might amount to. Particularly where Benjamin's critique of violence is concerned, which is read and cited across a multitude of disciplines, and at the same time, particularly at a time when the study and teaching of non-Anglophone modern languages is at a nadir, translating the essay seems to require more than just the passive transmission of an author's ideas from one linguistic receptacle to another, as if anyone, let alone Benjamin, ever believed that this ventriloquy for the sake of readers who don't understand the original language to be the task of the translator. Of course, now that Benjamin's been out of copyright for a little while, and versions have and will no doubt continue to proliferate, even law seems to encourage this view of translation as a means to a communicative end set by what is ultimately the most inessential quality of a work, namely its so-called information. But here's Benjamin himself on the matter from the preface he wrote to his translation and edition of Baudelaire's Tableau Parisien in the same year as he wrote toward the critic of violence. Quote, "Any translation that intends to perform a transmitting function cannot transmit anything but communication, hence something inessential. This is the hallmark of bad translations. Nor, however, can the translator simply be a poet, quote unquote, by which Benjamin means to say simply be satisfied with the, quote, inaccurate transmission of an inessential content. For Benjamin, the task of the translator is incommensurate with the demands of some idealized reader for accuracy. Rather, he writes, one ought to comprehend translation as a form. Unfolding, he writes, a work's life and afterlife, and demonstrating the kinship of languages, that was a quote also, in what they want to express by drawing attention to the distinction between what is meant and ways of meaning it. Of course, it certainly serves the purpose of law, or at least the purpose of those whose power is shored up by existing legal structures to obfuscate this role of translation in disclosing the irrelevance of accuracy for the, quote, perpetually renewed life of language. In a famously enigmatic passage of paragraph 14 of Toward the Critique of Violence, Benjamin refers to what he calls the strange and initially discouraging of experience of the ultimate undecidability or Unentscheidbarkeit of all legal problems, which in its hopelessness can perhaps be compared only with the impossibility of deciding conclusively on what is correct or false in evolving languages. Habit, no doubt, of, quote, conceiving of just ends as ends of a possible law conveniently renders uncommon this insight into the fact that it is not reason, after all, that decides on the justification of means or the justice of ends, but rather fateful violence. Not only is the function of such fateful violence non-transferable, or in Benjamin's words, non-mediate or nicht mittelbar, he writes, quote, ends that are just for one situation, universally recognized in this sense valid universally, are so for no other, even if in other respects the situation is ever so similar. Fateful violence also hides the non-mediacy of its function behind our very habit of conceiving possible law as capable of universalization. A little later on, in paragraph 16, Benjamin goes on to elaborate on the interest of established powers in maintaining this habit of ours. For the purpose of law, he writes with reference to Cohen, the transgression of boundaries is a matter of fate, even if the victim is unsuspecting. Ramifications of this conception of fate in respect to law continue to impress themselves into modernity, as the inadmissibility of the ignorance of the law as a defense against punishment amply shows. To come back to the question of translation, it would seem to be entirely in the interest of those who set boundaries and benefit from established law to amplify the virtues of accuracy to the letter of law, whether or not a human being has read it, in a move to circumvent a disclosure of the methodical ambiguity involved in laws switching out of accident for fate. Though, don't get me wrong, the translations of Benjamin in this volume are not unreliable. Inaccuracy, after all, also makes for a bad translation. My point, and Benjamin's point as well, is that fidelity to the original is not the same thing as accuracy. This means that fidelity in a translation involves somehow shedding light onto the kinship of languages and what they all want to express, pursuing, in Benjamin's words and the task of the translator, a course in the freedom of linguistic flux, and pointing, moreover, towards tangency and situated on the outside facing the wooded ridge. Translated, as it were, into the intentions we arrived at for this volume, one might say that, or I at least might say, that translating Benjamin's writings therefore involved attending to what I will call their paratexture, the formal tangents to the text and its ideas, in order to make that non-mediate function of legal violence tangible and present, and in the process to produce a critical edition. Paratexture is a term I myself arrived at only recently, but find to be an apt description of the intention behind the entire apparatus that we produced as co-editors of the volume. In French literary theory, and increasingly in translation studies, the term paratext has long been familiar, ever since Gérard Genette first coined it in his 1987 book, Seuil, to designate all the epitexts, prefaces, epigraphs, notes, glossaries, indices, and so forth that surround a text and enable it to become a book in the world. Genette also places emphasis on the physical aspects of the paratext. Without having the term in mind when first setting out on the work for the volume, I can nevertheless say that one of my interests was to draw out this kinship of languages involved in expressing the legal terminology that features in Benjamin's essay, a kinship that has till now more often than not been obscured or ignored. Most of this work happens in the footnotes to the essay. My motivation for this derives partly from the fact that one of the paratexts that we included as part of the associated fragments and text, item 22, is a book list called Literature for a More Fully Developed Critique of Violence and Philosophy of Law that, yes, indeed, we published for the first time in this volume, and that had been sitting on, so to speak, for quite a while, wondering what to do with it. As I try to outline in my afterword to the volume, it turns out that much of the content of this bibliography point towards a paratexture to the essay that is deeply entrenched in the legal history and structures of the long 19th century. This paratexture is also present in the essay of 1921, not just in the speculative traces of an extension thereof from around 1927. The terminology of Gewalt and its various cognates, of Macht or power, and of species and aspects of positive law and natural law under discussion in the 1921 essay are not inventions alone, but rather, as we try to show in the annotations, openings to a dialogue at times tense and always difficult with long-standing structures of law and legal violence from the Wilhelmine Empire. In the process of researching the notes, this was one of the most striking realizations of mine, that in spite of the gestures towards a, quote, recently lapsed German Revolution, and in spite of intervening so-called events, such as the recently elapsed World War, and the introduction of a new constitution based in a city that would lend its name to the entire interwar period, the legal language and structures based on this language still derive from Germany's imperial period. In other words, Benjamin sets up in this essay a kinship of languages in respect to a continuity of imperial legal violence that positive law, in employing the methodically ambiguous move to call upon the function of fateful violence, seeks to obfuscate. Here one could go back to statements that Benjamin makes elsewhere on the nature of philosophical terminology, for instance, and on philology and history, to build up a sense of how Benjamin would have perhaps formulated something explicit on the temporality specific to legal violence, a temporality that is not coincident with events or any of their theoretical amplifications, but rather somehow tangential to eventness. To capture something of this temporality, it may similarly be possible to revisit simply the final lines of the 1921 essay, in which, in the effort to, as Peter says, detomize and deflate the verbiage in which legal violence is ensconced, Benjamin turns to the rhythm, the manifest temporality of rhyme. And as we note, this is not the last time Benjamin would directly associate the rhythm of rhyme with the critique of violence. He returns to this propensity in the 1930s in his essay on Karl Kraus. But just to close, just a couple of somewhat more anecdotal remarks. Firstly, in my recollection, the last thing I believe we were composing for the volume over Zoom, no less, was the entry on Menge for the glossary at the end of the volume. We discovered in real time, I think, that Benjamin had in fact used the word Menge in a translation of his own, namely Baudelaire's poem Les Petites Vieilles, where it renders the word tous, or everyone, into his German. It is curious to note on this point that Menge, sometimes mass, sometimes crowd, should have also been a particularly loaded term for Benjamin, given the prominence of the critique of Gustave Le Bon's psychologie des foules in Sorel's Reflections on Violence, though Benjamin curiously does not cite this passage. Sorel's criticism of Le Bon might indeed have been befitting for Benjamin's argument, particularly around the passage in the 1921 essay where Benjamin discusses police violence, and specifically those with a degree of reflection against whom the state finds no protection in the law, thus instigating the deployment of the police to intervene in such legally ambiguous situations. But the point is that, especially in the most vulnerable areas, anyone can be a besonnene, that is, have degrees, that is to say, degrees of reflection are not the exclusive virtue of the educated or the politically and economically endowed. This point is something Sorel criticizes Le Bon for missing. Whatever else might have been left unspoken, we leave to the readers of this entry of our glossary, which, with its reference to Baudelaire at the end of the volume, we thought was a fitting opportunity to circle back to the volume's very first extended paratext, the note on the translations. Second and final remark, in the process of researching the status of this book list, Literature for a More Fully Developed Critique of Violence and Philosophy of Law, I realized that it also contained the one autographic reference to Walter Lehmann in Benjamin's corpus. Lehmann being his erstwhile docent in ancient Mesoamerican cultures and languages during his first years at university, and at whose seminars he famously met the friend he would refer to in letters to Scholem and others as the genius, Felix Noguerat. Benjamin would later send Lehmann a dedicated copy of Toward the Critique of Violence and borrow a book from him, Joseph Kohler's Law of the Aztecs. What ensued was a rather unexpected period of research in Berlin, for me that is, deep diving into Lehmann's archives at the Ibero-American Institute, which felicitously contains across 15 or 20 uncatalogued boxes several copies of a project from 1916 that Benjamin refers to in his letters as Lehmann's enormously important discoveries in the study of mythology. Lehmann's work, as well as Kohler's, also belong to that other temporality that is inhabited by the rhythm of terminology and the continuities of Wilhelmine law. In fact, they're enabled by German imperial networks of the circulation of ideas and translations. Here, attention to the paratexture of the 1921 essay directly opens up its many unanswered questions concerning the excesses that remain after the critique of fateful violence non-mediacy to the field of paracoloniality, to cite Delete Manon. What remains, in other words, after a translation of the critique of violence that runs counter to the habit of rendering violence's verbiage accurate, makes the non-transferability of fateful violence tangible and present. Perhaps a decolonial afterlife of the insight that, quote, ends that are just for one situation, universally recognized and in this sense valid universally, are so for no other, even if in other respects the situation is ever so similar. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Julia. So I now invite, of course, all of our participants, if they would like to pose any questions to our panelists, avail themselves of the Q&A function. They will likely find in the bottom bar of their of the screen. We have one question, but first, maybe whilst we wait for other ones to come, I don't know if any of our speakers, editors, translators would like to make any comments on or ask each other questions or anything of that sort, or follow up on things that have been raised by your fellow authors.
Well, I'm going to say that I wish we had done this earlier. I mean, there's so many things to talk about with respect to the different trajectories that all of the other texts, the non-Benjamin ones, just go in such remarkably different directions. It's really stunningly interesting to hear it all put together. I mean, you see it in the volume, but also to hear the kind of reflections on what Benjamin is doing and what the text under quotation marks. I think that the Benjamin probably did read Lederer's critique of violence. He doesn't comment on it, but he did go and visit him in Heidelberg, and he was being habilitated. And the person who took his position was Karl Mannheim, who he had conversations with. So there's this very interesting crossing. And Lederer is perfectly described as this very interesting left figure who was mainstream, but inviting something else. And the principal person he was inviting was Bloch. He knew Bloch. He was working with Bloch. And that's how we got to know Benjamin. So it's an interesting node, which has its. I think you're absolutely right. There are corresponding figures in contemporary academic world who are working in institutions, inviting voices, but also very nervous about having those voices. So they're not going to publish them in this, but they'll publish them that. And it's an important position to see what Benjamin is doing by projecting him against someone like Lederer, who's politically very, very left, very much a part of a socialist revision, particularly of the Austrian government. Just after the war, that was eliminated, but also nervous about the kind of work that Bloch and Benjamin were doing, but not nervous enough to just wholly reject it. That's just one, but I would actually go around and reflect on each of what people said, but I probably shouldn't take up that much time.
I was wondering maybe if either you or Julia, or indeed any of the other participants, wanted to say something for the audience, because I think it's a very interesting aspect of the novel paratext. The question of the place of this text that we now treat, as a standalone. I mean, obviously within the broader range of Benjamin's writings and discourses on violence, but the place of it within the projected or variously projected volume on politics, etc. Because I think that would be also an interesting supplement to some of the things that we've already discussed.
Well, I'll quickly say that that Bloch, if you look at the Weißen Blätter, that Lederer had clearly had something in mind, and probably discussing with Bloch about how it's going to be constructed. Bloch has the first essay, which has to do with about the difference between a political and a spiritual Führer, leader. It's a problem with the Führerprinzip, the leader principle. The whole Duce matter. This is what Bloch is trying to think about, and it's closely connected to what Bruce was discussing with respect to, let's use the Weberian terms, because Weber's everywhere in this discussion. He's just he's the atmosphere in which the discussion is taking place, the charismatic figure, because they're the interpretations of where the charisma lies, what generates the charisma. And in fact, Benjamin's essay can be seen as a kind of as a deflation of the charismatic. But in any case, so this is what Bloch is responding to in the initial essay in the Weißen Blätter. Benjamin's place is to follow Bloch, and what Lederer seemed to expect, I'm guessing, from the possible topic of the true politician, which has been lost. Benjamin gave it to Lederer, and he said he wasn't going to publish it now, but maybe later. Is that Benjamin probably said something that's very different than what? Well, maybe it's different, but maybe it's similar to what Bruce said. That maybe said that in politics there are no leaders. That's the fundamental principle of the true politician. They're terms, but no leaders. that the political never takes the point of convincing anyone to do anything, saying anything that ever has an effect. Whenever that happens, there's a profound neutralization, depoliticization. And this was too much for Lederer. It's an evacuation of the very notion of the political, very closely related to the evacuation of the friend-enemy distinction. Anyway, we lost the essay. Just this is a reconstruction. It could be a fantasy on my part, but that seemed to me to be the lost paratext, actually the correlate for what Benjamin was doing in So Critique Gewalt. We don't know what he was doing because he wrote this essay, he finished it, he sent it off, people read it, and it is the complement to what he was doing, having something to do with the principle of what a politician is when that politician is actually true, which doesn't mean honest or forthright or sincere. And I'll stop.
Just to confirm that, I think that that's exactly where Unger takes his essay in a section we didn't read. He again directs it specifically toward the possibility of a prophetic Führer. And there is a need, he argues, for some kind of Führer, but it isn't one that organizes the Menge. So what I would say about that word Menge that Julia brought up is that for, at least in Unger's mind, it's a non-organic community, a community bound together out of atomistic individuals into a mechanistic whole. So for Unger, and I think there's something working in Benjamin as well, the machine versus organism contrast is really critical. So that politics in its truest metaphysical form is not a machine that develops an instrumentality toward a goal. It's not a means-ends relationship. It's some kind of instantaneous breakthrough at a point which is the Führer point, but it's a breakthrough that then resonates completely throughout the entire community. And what that actually looks like is best represented in myths, in the kind of thing where you murder or where there's a sacrificial victim that on whose blood or on whose body a city is founded. Now, how that works in modernity, I mean, I think it's very critical to understand that there's a truly dangerous line that is getting crossed here by Benjamin. Anyway.
Anybody would like to follow up on that, or should we move to the couple of questions in the Q&A? Yeah. So I'll read them out. One is quite brief, and the other one is more not more substantial, but in any case longer. So the first from Basma Berbesh, if I'm pronouncing it right. There are points of similarity. I guess it's a question. I'll give it an interrogative tone. What are the points of similarity, or are there points of similarity between Benjamin's evaluation of violence and Girard's theories on violence and the crisis of violence? Does anyone have any views or comments on that? You're nodding, Bruce, so maybe you have a.
I would just take it back to that founding violence, because certainly both of them are interested in the way in which violence can be a foundational act that, it would be interesting to speculate what is the condition of possibility of a foundational act of violence. For Girard, it's the indiscriminateness of hierarchy. We lose everything is mirroring, every desire mirroring everyone else's desire. I'm not certain what for Benjamin is the condition of possibility of a foundational act of violence. I don't know. That's an interesting question. It's not clear to me what he would think.
I can say I remember asking René Girard when he was very young if he had ever read Benjamin's essay, and he didn't seem to recognize it. It was that well known. It was a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
But there's another element of this question which is a good one. It's potentially productive one, although I think there are reasons why Girard's later, I mean, I didn't follow it that much, but makes it harder to work with. But it's that Benjamin was also deeply connected with, concerned with the mechanism for Girard of violence, which was mimesis. I mean, if there's a thinker of mimesis and violence, it's Benjamin. And it's a very rich problem. I mean, one of the things is the question of whether Girard has a unfortunately restrained notion of mimesis, where it's just basically imitation. And it involves, acquisitive desire is the only optic in which mimesis happens. And all the other features of mimesis, including the ones that Benjamin is particularly concerned with, which are deeply connected to a certain cosmicism. In fact, you could even use the word universism, having to do with his connection to this reading of this De Groot, this Dutch sinologist. But so there's my quick statement, having known a little bit of Girard and working with Benjamin, is that there's a correspondence, but Girard is much too quick to cut off the terms. His violence is just bloody violence. I mean, you wouldn't even, Benjamin's notion of a bloodless violence, which we haven't talked of, which is, say, divine violence, pure violence, wouldn't mean anything. If you read the violence of the sacred, it's all just bloody violence, and that's the founding thing. If anything else I can't imagine Girard even making this meaningful. And similarly with mimesis, instead of the entire cosmicism, one might say, the entirety of mimesis, where it's everything, where it's corporeal and the double dimension of the corporeal, the Leib and Körper dimension, they both have their mimetic qualities. Now it's just acquisitive desire. If somebody wants something, I'm going to imitate that person, and that's the genesis of all desire. There's no anything that anyone intrinsically wants, which is true, I would say, but it's restrained. It doesn't see the dimensions of violence on the one hand and mimesis on the other.
I don't think I'm disagreeing, and we shouldn't talk all about Girard. But it does bring us to the question of Benjamin, namely that myth in Girard is the concealment of the foundational act of violence in its arbitrariness. And so what I think would be an interesting, again, to compare is the way in which, for Girard, a revelation of the arbitrariness of the violence, which would be for, I think, Benjamin, a revelation of its Schicksal nature, because really fate is nothing, there is no true fate. It is purely a construction after the fact. So maybe the revelation of the Schicksal or arbitrariness of the violence is a kind of violence. I mean, but it's the violence for Girard in his Christian phase. It's the violence of the cross that reveals the arbitrariness of the mythic dimension of the sacrificial victim being the one who somehow embodies the entirety of the state and therefore has to be excluded. I think I think more is at work in the relationship between Girard and Benjamin than maybe we've given it credit. I've never put the two together, but I think that they're thinking in very similar ways, probably because they've been reading a lot of the very same texts.
Okay. Maybe I'll read our next question, and we have two more now. So this is from Jacob Bard Rosenberg. So he says, thanks to all the speakers. I wanted to ask a question that leads back to Peter's remark about the strangely limiting conceptuality of violence in Benjamin's essay. as all bad other than weltende Gewalt. I was wondering about the gesture of complexifying and enriching an account of Benjaminian Gewalt through an appeal to the plurality and interest of sources and contexts. In a peculiar way, making violence the medium of law politics is a crude thing to do and encourages crude or forceful views and acts. It is homologous to the making the world thingly in the Trauerspiel book under the conditions of natural history. Out of the very crudeness of things and the brutality of violence, Benjamin forges a crucible through a sort of infinite reflection within this world made crude. I wonder how much this gesture is undermined by trying to make these matters so rich and intellectual, but how much has violence remained a crude, and how much can we read it as such today compared to the time of Benjamin's writing? So would anybody like to step in on that?
You know, that I'm sorry, I keep on jumping in. Think about the First World War and what he says about it in To the Planetarium, where he talks about the trenches as some kind of sacrificial act or place where a new man is being born. I think that he doesn't, in fact, reduce violence to the crude. I think what he's looking for is a form of sacred violence that can erupt and shatter the crudeness of the violence that that he sees around. And so, for him, somehow the massive death. It's a shocking statement that he makes into the Planetarium is going to turn into this sacred moment of sacrificial gifting of blood to the birth of a new technophysis. There's that. I don't know whether there's that element in this text, and there's that element in his thinking in the 20s that I think sacralizes assert violence. Yeah.
I'm just going to say, I'm not sure if I agree with that's what's happening in the Zum Planetarium, but I would just say this is a translation issue. Gewalt in German is a pretty normal word that doesn't have the resonance of violence all the time. It's everywhere. It saturates the German language in all kinds of forms, and the translation to violence, I mean, our colleague, my teacher, my friend, Sam Weber, just doesn't do it. He just calls it the Krieg of Force. And it's not to be mistaken, that's not wrong. I mean, Sam's German is really good. So I think it's a very good question, but it's also delicate, having to do with the fact that, yes, everything governmental is Gewalt-like. That's just, and here it's more like the Foucauldian governmentality. Everything involving any disciplinary taming force has a Gewalt character to it for Benjamin, including education. We haven't talked about educational violence, and apparently Benjamin is for corporeal punishment, and which is probably true. But we know that's another small but important element of what he's doing here. That's just a commentary on the problem of the problem of drawing this text out of German, where the Gewalt term is probably not principally associated with violence. It's associated with administration, if I can put it that way. But others can,
I mean, that's why I think also there's a peculiar effect, especially to the discussion of the forms of negotiated pressure in the strike, right? Julia mentioned Goldsmith, so it's all relevant also to very quotidian matters of the reproduction of academic labor these days, at least in the UK. So there's something strange, right? Because if you read it in English, then there almost seems to be a suggestion, which appears to be a very problematic, nay, reactionary suggestion, that there's something violent about putting pressure on your employer to pay you more, right, by withdrawing your labor, right? So, and that somehow but then there's almost an overcompensation of that to say, okay, well, this transcends the dimension of violence only when it transcends the dimension of instrumentality, right? Or you know, when the proletarian general strike is beyond, right? Because you're trying to remove the very idea of an employer, right? You're not trying to get your employer to do something. You're trying to say there shall be no more employers, and therefore you've kind of passed the threshold beyond the calculative, instrumental character of applying a force in order to, you know, kind of achieve a result. So I thought, you know, that was one of the, you know, in a sense, where Jacob was mentioning the kind of question of the crudeness. In a sense, but the crudeness is in terms of a question of instrumentality, not so much in terms of brutality or anything like that, which is actually strangely absent from an essay written in the wake of the carnage of war and the killing of Liebknecht, Luxembourg, and sundry revolution, etc. Right? It doesn't. There's something kind of bloodless, right, about bloodless, because of course it's trying to reach a much more, in a sense, what it presents is a much more foundational dimension, right? Where actually, as a critique, it's not. And I guess that's also why the pacifism is a problem, right? Because pacifism doesn't engage in a critique. Pacifism just repels and rejects the blood and the violence without, you know, truly grappling with its foundations. In any case, I just thought that was you know, I when I read the text again, I'm always kind of stuck with the peculiarity of the role that the negotiating character of the strike has in Benjamin, and the presentation of that, right, as violent, and the need to get beyond it, not out of a critique of reformism, right, because that could also be one way of thinking about it, but for a different rationale, right, which is not, again, not Sorel's rationale as such at all. But that's just my kind of comment. Maybe we can push this a little further by moving to the third. Sorry, we have we have two more questions. So one is whether anybody would like to elaborate more on the question of divine violence, and given its in many respects enigmatic character. Perhaps this is a time also to discuss the bloodlessness that we have not yet broached. And then I'll just read out the other question, because maybe we can bring them together, since I think we're getting close towards our time limit. And the next question is from Diego Fernandez. I would like to ask you for the projection of Benjamin's essay to his later work, and in particular regarding the question of justice concerning Gewalt, and how this problem appears later in the Kafka essay of 34, linked to the category of study as the, quote, port to the justice, or door to the justice, or something like that. So yeah, those two, maybe we can end, and if anybody has any final comments as well on those questions. So that of divine violence, and that of the afterlives of this critique in Benjamin's later work. Of course, Julia's already dealt a lot with that in the afterword, but maybe further on into the 30s. So, Julia, did you want to come in or on either of those questions? Either on divine violence or on the place of Gewalt in Benjamin's writings on Kafka and later?
Well, just, I mean, I guess very briefly on the second question. So I guess the sort of key, sort of the central point in the 1921 essay, when Benjamin starts really discussing the link that he sees via Cohen between myth and modern law, that quote is obviously sort of reproduced verbatim in the Kafka essay from 1934. So that's sort of, just very briefly, yeah, that's you know, clearly there's lots. I think there's lots of lots of ways one could go about like sort of disambiguating like what the connection actually is, like depending on how you interpret the context of like the 1921 use of the quote, obviously. But this is that's the one sort of obvious philological link to the later work, specifically the Kafka essay. I don't know if Donna has something more to say about the Cohen connection or anything. And in respect to the concept of divine violence, it's like the one, like the most, I don't know, like, I mean, I'm not sure if there's like a, brief or any kind of adequate answer one could give to what exactly this is. But I mean, just in terms of like there's a couple of things that, are interesting to me at the moment, thinking about that particular passage. And it's that in the way that Benjamin introduces divine violence, he's utilizing a couple of sort of like paradigmatic structures in the analysis of myth and its others, right? So for instance, like this is the famous sort of distinction between Niobe and the passage in the Hebrew Bible about Korach. So there's a sort of rather than sort of like identifying once and for all what divine violence is supposed to be, one of the ways to approach that question would literally be like what's going on in terms of like the name divine violence being given to a type of bloodlessness that devolves away from certain mythic structures that Benjamin has then in like just the preceding couple of paragraphs noted as due to a habit of ours of assuming that assuming certain sort of causal relations that are associated with legal, like law and its various Gewalten, administrations and more sort of violent manifestations thereof. And secondarily, the way this mythic violence is what he calls mythic violence describes also the self-reproduction of a type of violence by way of including its own so-called expiation. What divine violence is supposed to be in contrast to that, and again, like, I suppose I would want to emphasize the fact that divine violence is not really extricable from the context of its comparison, and it's like sort of quasi, it's not exactly a negation, but it's like, it's quasi like sort of not a non-mythic character, like, the character of kind of violence that is not any of this sort of self-reproductive kind of violence that includes its own ending in terms of, with the prospect into its prospect of its own endurance and perpetuation, is that it gets rid of that entire structure of punishment and introduces perhaps in the name of bloodlessness, a different form of how to negotiate the aftermath of a particular kind of justice that doesn't, for instance, in the mythic case, simply reproduce guilty bodies and it perpetuates a mourning over the after effects of being punished. It sounds like a little bit weird. I'm literally just redescribing what Benjamin says about the Niobe legend, obviously, right? So in mythic violence, the non-divine violence, what law does is essentially produce itself, right, on the basis of producing guilty bodies on which its punishment can be enacted. So in a way, divine violence is that which is not the kind of violence that reproduces itself on the back of the criminalization of certain kinds of bodies. onto which punishment may be exacted. And I think it's also, I mean, again, this is like my personal interest at this moment in time, since I'm thinking about Niobe quite a bit at the moment, but it's not an accident. I think that this is like a maternal body, right? I don't think it's an accident that this is like a very fecund maternal body that whose children get, you know, I don't think it's an accident that this is like a particular kind of mourning of a mother, and that, you know, this is not exactly elaborated in Benjamin's essay, but definitely something to think about in contrast to like whatever bloodless violence is supposed to be. I hope that was halfway satisfactory. I think maybe I'd like to sort of pass the question of what is exactly bloodless violence to maybe somebody. Oh, I'm just curious to hear.
Austin, you had your hand raised. Oh.
Yeah, I was going to say the question was about the projection into Benjamin's later work. One name that we haven't mentioned so far is Adorno, and it just occurred to me, picking up on Peter's remark about the ubiquitousness of Gewalt in German. Of course, it makes me think straight away of the semantic field between Gewalt and Verwaltung, the totally administered world that's then, you know, conceptualized further by Adorno and Horkheimer and so on. And that gets towards bloodless violence. And it's just interesting to hear that conceptual semantic field of resonance, you know, between Gewalt and die verwaltete Welt and so on. So Adorno is some figure that we haven't actually mentioned, but kind of could do.
Yeah, that's a complex one to follow up. Maybe I'll just also before, because we're kind of drawing a bit to a close, but I didn't want to leave any questions pending. So there's one from Ruben Sebastian Sanchez Letana. He says, I'm interested in knowing if Benjamin's critique of violence addresses Richert's Kulturwissenschaft. I'm interested in understanding the possible appropriation or critique by Benjamin of the notions of value, validity, and spheres of value as these pertain to the problem of historical knowledge. Does anybody have a...
Yeah. Well, I'll say that, you know, Benjamin was a student of Rickert. He took 3 classes with him. One of which, at least in the classes, Heidegger was also there, at least in 2 of them. I'm not sure about the third, including a small seminar that the 2 of them took on Bergson. So Martin was over there, Walter was there, and Rickert was probably talking all the time, because Rickert was definitely one of the figures who created gigantic tomes, one after another after another. But it's a good question. And actually, we have some notes about this. Julie and I have notes having concern where there's this very important point in the critique of violence where there's an evaluation where he's talking about the evaluation of a criterion having to do with the value. An evaluation is a matter of the value, and the argument is very complex. This is a place where, if we had time, we could do a reading. We could look at the text. We could share the text and try to see what Benjamin is doing at that very point. But there is an Auseinandersetzung with Rickert's value theory and its attempt to produce, and this is one of the seminars, actually lectures that Benjamin attended, its attempt to produce a counter Lebensphilosophie, a philosophy of what Rickert called das vollendete Leben, in contrast to das bloße Leben. And Benjamin simply adopts in this text, and then Giorgio takes over many years later, the Rickertian notion of das bloße Leben. But the question is, but he doesn't adopt the counter concept, which is a completed life, full life that, well, it's very interesting. Actually, Vollendung is a very interesting term in this context. And so the entire text can be understood just as Heidegger's text of this very moment in 1921. He's producing some text in order to get an academic career going, that having to do with a very clear Auseinandersetzung, altercation, confrontation with the Ricartian, and in fact the entire that version of neo-Kantianism, the point of which is to transcend both Lebensphilosophy as it's generally understood, which means both Nietzsche and Bergson, but also not to reproduce academic terms, that it's just the general academicism in German literature and German philosophy, which consists in establishing a set of polar terms and then showing that the polarity is ultimately a unity. Because that's not what they're doing, Heidegger and Benjamin, at this moment. And one of the elements of this in Benjamin's essay is taking this polar term, das bloße Leben, mere life, but not giving us the slightest idea of what the counter term is, which is the title of Ricart's gigantic tome, which he produces a year or so later, like 1921 or 22.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. I think it's been, though, of course, we could do many installments of this discussion, and hopefully we'll have other chances to come together. I wanted, for my part, to thank you all and for sure also the audience for listening and for participating with some very interesting questions. And just to leave Samir to close our event.
Thanks, Alberto. I'll be rather brief. On behalf of the Institute, I would just like to thank all of the participants on this roundtable, which could be described as a kind of masterclass in intertextuality. It's been an extremely rich discussion. It's like a phenomenal resource, this book. And so thank you all, Peter, Julia, Lisa Marie, Austin, Donna, Bruce, and again, a special thank you to Alberto for putting this all together, for chairing. I'd also, of course, like to thank the audience for attending and for your great comments and questions. It's been a really engaging session. Thanks very much, and hope to see you again at some of our future events. The next one, as I said, is coming up on the 23rd, Marcuse and Adorno on narcissism. So hope to see you then. Yeah, thanks again. All the best.
Thank you.